Shalom, shalom. We're so glad you're here. People are trickling in, and thanks for the early comers. I want to let you know about next week. We have a session with Dr. Steinmetz, From History to Story, the Haggadah's Invitation to Imagination. We hope as we approach Pesach that you will join us for that. We also have a session with Professor Clausen on the Jewish ethics, the basics based on his new book. So we hope you'll consider joining us for that. Today's conversation is on a new book called And They Arose Early to Do Sexual Violence, My Personal Mirror of Torah. Really looking forward to doing this in Chavruta. We're going to look at this in conversation. And while I will take the initial questions with our speaker today, we will invite you in as well, both in the chat as well as if you want to unmute after our initial conversation. Today's topic is partially about the book at large and on sexual violence through a Jewish lens and personal lens, but more particularly about Shimon and Levi and the massacre of Shechem. So let me tell you about Ethan Davidson. He is an author, musician, and philanthropist, and he has authored 2 books, recorded 15 albums, and toured throughout North America and Europe. In 2005, he left his touring life and returned to his Detroit roots, where he helps run the William Davidson Foundation, established by his late father, Bill Davidson, of blessed memory. Private Family Foundation strives to fulfill its founder's legacy by advancing the economic, cultural, and civic vitality of Southeast Michigan, the state of Israel, and the Jewish community for future generations. Foundation has a huge impact on the Jewish world, and Ethan is a chavruta, and a mensch and a scholar, and I'm thrilled to have him here today. So Ethan, thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Rav Shmuley. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I'm sorry that we're not there in person this time, but, God willing soon.
Well, I'm glad you said that because anyone who is local, if you show up at our office, we will give you a free copy of this book. Yeah. And we would love to give you that. It's well worth it. Well,
it's free in a way. You didn't ask for it necessarily, but I'll say I'm offering it to you for free if you'll make, I'm sure your audience already is making donations to Valley Beit Midrash, but if they'll make an additional, reach it a little deeper, make additional donation, I'll trust them, then they can have, that's the cost of the book.
Okay, I love it. Thank you for that. Okay, so tell me, you have so many interests and there's so much happening in the world. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've been studying this subject in a couple of different chavrusas, the subject of sexual violence in the Jewish texts for a number of years, really, and not just the violence itself, but then the responses to that violence. And, some of those responses are sort of justifiable and within certain limits and measured. All too often in the text, we see that responses to this kind of violence kind of go beyond the measure. And this topic was interesting to me for personal reasons, which we can get into a little bit, later maybe. So I've studied it for a couple of years, and I always thought, gee, I'd like to write about this someday. Maybe this will become a book. And then what prompted me to actually sit down and write it was not just the events of October 7th and the sexual violence, but even more so the, if I can say rape denial that I saw from friends of mine, also people in positions of power, and or the contextualization of sexual violence that I saw from people in positions of power that would say, yes, Hamas committed sexual violence, but we have to put it in this context of this, wider conflict. And my attitude was like, no, why are we now contextualizing this kind of violence? It should be, I would have thought that all of us in the world could agree sexual violence is always bad, period, like full stop. So I was shocked to see that there were people that had a different feeling about that. And of course, the subsequent war in Gaza and how that was being prosecuted, I had various questions about that as well. So I wanted to write this book to, sort of put forth my exploration of these issues in the text and how the text can help us understand what these issues are and how we respond to this kind of violence. So I hope in that way it's helpful. But that was the impetus for sitting down and writing it.
Okay, I love that, and so important. I similarly felt a lot of frustration and even despair, lost relationships over that reaction that you described. There's lots of relativity in the world, and there are some things that ought to have clear red lines. So this is not only historical and intellectual; it's also in some ways meant to be personal. Can you share with us a bit about how you experience Torah as a mirror that can help us identify our own experiences and responses to violence? I'm very intrigued by that.
Absolutely. Well, first, to speak a bit generally and then more specifically about what I mean as Torah as a mirror. I've gone through various stages in my life with these texts. I was a, day school kid, so I was familiar with these texts at a young age and sort of took them at face value, I guess. When I got later on into college and came across the documentary hypothesis, that made sense to me. And I thought, okay, it's a settled issue that these texts were written in various times and places by guys in caves somewhere. As I went through later stages of my life, I began to question whether, that really was the final word. And maybe there's things in the text that, point to some other, source. You could say from God through Moses at Sinai, however you want to say it. And then at a certain stage, I guess I began to think, none of that's really particularly important to me. What I have in front of me is the text itself, however it came to be in my hand. How am I going to make the best use of that for myself? What does it mean to me? And I began to see the Torah and other Jewish texts really as a therapeutic tool, a psychotherapeutic tool, let's say, and begin to see how can I unpack things that are happening inside of myself through an exploration of the text. I take Rav Soloveitchik at his word that the human, says this towards the end of Halachic Man, that the human creates himself or creates herself. So if part of my mission is to create myself more fully as a human being in God's image, maybe these texts can be a part of that, but I sort of have to use them to reflect to myself what's happening inside of myself. So when I find complications in the text, things that make me uncomfortable, things that are difficult to understand, I have to use that to ask myself, well, what is it about myself that I'm having trouble with? Maybe that's where the block is, and it's not so much in the language. When we come to the issue, particularly of sexual violence, without going into a lot of detail, I mean, at a younger stage in my life, I was subject to such violence, and I, had spent time in sort of, regular, I guess I'm going to say regular psychotherapy, dealing with that. But as I began to encounter these episodes in the text as well, it was helpful for me to further unpack those experiences and my thoughts and feelings around what happened on October 7th and the footage that I saw from there, and why I was so outraged at the rape denial or the sexual violence contextualization. Apart from that should just bother me as a rational human being anyway, but based on personal experience, why, were there other layers there that I wanted to understand and uncover? So I know that's a long answer, but that's sort of really what I mean in terms of saying that these texts are like a mirror. And I would even go a step further and say it's sort of like an X-ray mirror. I see myself reflected in them, but I really see reflected in them what's going on inside of myself. And I find that the Jewish texts are really, particularly if we approach them, or I should say, if I approach them, I don't want to speak for any of you, but if I approach these texts honestly and not try to make the texts fit to whatever preconceived agenda I might have. But to confront them honestly, I can hopefully begin to unpack and understand and metabolize really what is happening inside of me. So that's what I mean by a Torah as a mirror or an X-ray mirror.
Wow. Wow. I love that. I have a few reactions to that. One is in relation to the last thing you said of no preconceived agenda, and balancing that alongside this personal dimension that you're not avoiding.
Right.
Because those might be, seen as, conflicting.
Sure.
And I think someone could argue that Torah is about facts, it's about law, it's about objectivity, it's almost mathematical. This is not subjective or relative or personal. And you're going the opposite way in a sense. And I mean, one of my potential critique of Rav Soloveitchik is his legal formalism, right? That it's almost too cold and impersonal, to apply, Jewish legal matters to human lives. But you bring a new Soloveitchik in, which I think is very interesting, that his teaching on Bria Chadasha, that you become a new person, and the potential for textual learning, Torah learning, to be a process towards teshuvah, both the healing side of teshuvah, but also the clarifying side of responsibility.
That's right.
And I love that, what you're saying there, of that it's really a whole new pathway of learning Torah.
Well, I'll give you one, if I can. I'll give you one, quick, concrete example. I think that brings it up because, the Ger Rebbe, I think maybe the fourth or fifth Ger Rebbe, says, when God says, "Let us create the human," who is God speaking to? And in the Ger Rebbe's estimation, God says, "Well, God is speaking to the human," like saying, "Come on, Shmuley, come on, Ethan, let us create the human," right? So when I go back and read the first few verses of Genesis with that understanding, I'm like, okay, I get it. It's about the creation of the world. That's fine.
Right.
I wasn't there, so I can't really relate to that. I'm sitting here in 21st century Detroit. What do I know about the creation of the world? But God's face is floating across an undifferentiated and chaotic sea. And I'm like, oh, that's what's happening inside of me. Inside of me, there's a fathomless and dark and chaotic sea, and I have to bring light or consciousness to that. And I begin to say, oh, this part of me is like dry ground. This part of me is like sea. This part of me, or I react to this situation in this way. I have a negative reaction. I have a positive reaction. And I begin to be able to understand and describe things and organize the interior world, and so it becomes something other than a dark and chaotic sea. So that's, I think, Torah as a therapeutic tool. I write about it a little bit in the previous book.
I love that. Just so friends unpack that first point. Normally, when we say God says, "Let us create humans," God is it's understood that God's talking to angels, right? But Ethan's offering a new interpretation that it's actually. One of my, putting on my animal welfare hat, one of the reads I like is that God is talking to the animals.
Right.
Let us create humans, out of the divine, mold and the animal mold. Okay, so I love that. So let's turn to the rape of Dinah and her brother's response.
Yeah.
Are there innocent people in Shechem? How do you think about innocence? And how do we understand this story as traditional readers of the text that look up to our ancestors? It's one thing to say, oh, all humans have vices. Of course, biblical figures have vices. It's another thing if we think this is something atrocious. So how do you relate to the brother's response?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, about 2 months after October 7th, I had the opportunity to meet with some of the hostage families. I met with a man by the last name of Moses, whose father, 80-year-old father, Gadi Moses, was taken hostage. He's since been released. But at the time that I met with the Moses family, of course, they didn't know if their father was alive or dead or whatever. And Mr. Moses, I'm sorry, I forget the son's name. He had been, a peacenik, I guess, to use my language. He had been a guy that had worked with the Palestinian community and, to try to build a better life for people. But after going through this trauma, I remember he said, there's he said, there's no innocent people in Gaza. And look, whether or not I hold a different view, I'm not going to argue with the man. He's gone through a terrible trauma. His 80-year-old father is God knows where at that time. And so I'm not going to dispute that with him, but that it stuck with me, that attitude. And so when I went to this story that I wrote about in this book about Shechem, just to recap the story a little bit for those who may not be familiar, and we don't have to read the whole thing here, but you'll see it if you want to read through. And I don't know if I think the source sheet is available on Sefaria. Jacob has a number of sons and one daughter, of course, and she goes out, to visit with some friends apparently, and while she's out, the local non-Israelite prince, a guy by the name of Shechem, and the people are named Shechem, the nation is also named Shechem. This prince, sees her, rapes her, and kidnaps her. And, and then after he's done this, I guess he falls in love with her or something. And anyway, two of Jacob's sons, Shimon and Levi, go to negotiate with Shechem, and there's a proposal from Shechem that, look, we can intermarry, we can share our wealth, we can share our property, but Shechem really wants to marry Dinah, this woman that he's kidnapped. And so Shimon and Levi agree to this on the condition that that all of the men of Shechem circumcise themselves, which they then do. And after this mass circumcision of Shechem, while the men of Shechem are recovering from this, Shimon and Levi descend and massacre the entire population, carrying off the women and the children and the property. And their father Jacob is really troubled by this. He's not. He doesn't agree. He seems not to agree that this was the correct course of action. As a matter of fact, when you go towards the end of the book of Genesis, when Jacob is on his deathbed, there in Genesis 49, Jacob is on his deathbed, and he sort of curses Shimon and Levi. There, he says that their instruments in the Hebrew, you can see it there. He says that they are kli Hamas. It's one of the times in the text that we see the word Hamas, which of course, even though it might be spelled slightly differently in modern Hebrew, the word means violence, right, or cruelty. This is the name of this terror organization that is the name of which is a double entendre in itself, has a different meaning in Arabic than it means. It's an acronym in Arabic, but means violence in Hebrew. Anyway, Jacob says that these are, what they used were kli Hamas, instruments of violence. So Jacob really, even into the end of his life, decades later, has a really serious problem with this massacre that Shimon and Levi executed upon the entire male population of Shechem. So that's a recap of the story for the rabbis that I see on the phone, not just Rav Shmuley, but I see my friend Rabbi David Golinkin. Was there anything that I missed there that I should have said? I want to include other people in the conversation there too.
No, that was a good synopsis of the story.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi David.
Great. Rabbi Golinkin, are you in Israel tonight?
Yes, I'm in Jerusalem.
Okay, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us from
My pleasure.
David is an old friend and Chavrusa, and I've learned a lot from him over many years, and he was close with my father as well. So it's an honor to have you here, David.
Thank you. My pleasure. And for me, 10 o'clock at night is not late, so it's okay.
just getting started. So Jacob has a real problem with this, and so what I was and I thought, that's already a really interesting tension that we have. Let's say heroes from our tradition, heroes from our text, who have completely different sensibilities to what is or is not appropriate, in the case of a rape and a kidnapping, right? And so these are represent two different poles on how we might think about how to prosecute, criminals that are engaged in sexual violence or kidnapping and that thing, and how might you prosecute, God forbid, a war in response to this kind of thing. And again, for the moment, I'm not taking sides here. I'm just laying out what the text tells us. What I've included here next is a little bit from Rambam's Mishneh Torah, just to set a little more of the stage. What I've got is three different of our classical commentators that will represent different viewpoints on this. So I don't know if somebody online there would like to read in English what the Rambam brings in from Mishneh Torah in response to this massacre at Shechem. I'm willing to open it up to anybody who's brave enough to read for us.
How must the Noachites fulfill the commandment to establish laws and courts? They are obligated to set up judges and magistrates in every major city to render judgment concerning these 6 mitzvot and to admonish the people regarding their observance. A Noachite who transgresses these 7 commands shall be executed by decapitation. For this reason, all the inhabitants of Shechem were obligated to die. Shechem kidnapped, they observed and were aware of his deeds, but did not judge him. A Noachite is executed on the basis of the testimony of one witness and the verdict of a single judge. No warning is required. Relatives may serve as witnesses. However, a woman may not serve as a witness or a judge for them.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, of course. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Judy. And yeah, I mean, I've got some other problems with this as well, of course. But the first thing, I mean, just for our germane to our topic today, I mean, what's the Rambam saying here? He's saying, look, Shechem kidnapped. The people of Shechem saw this, but they didn't bring him, and they have an obligation to bring him to justice. I guess even though he's their ruler, right? They have an obligation to bring him to justice, and they failed in that regard. So to me, I guess what the Rambam is saying is that, therefore they're culpable in this and obligated to die. He says clearly there. So I don't know if anybody has any reaction to that.
I absolutely do. This is outrageous. This is you assume that everyone knows.
Right.
We don't. How do we know that? It's nowhere in the text. So I think the Rambam is playing judge, jury, and executioner on this one. And it's a low cost thing for him to do because it's all in history. He doesn't have to actually deal with real people.
Exactly.
But no warning is required.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Anybody else, agree or feel differently about that? Otherwise, we can move on to the Maharal of Prague in the Gur Aryeh for a somewhat different response.
Well, before we do, I just want to give voice to Judy's question in the chat, and I want to add to it.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that.
That's fine. I'm happy to manage that. Why did the tribe of Levi get the great honor of becoming priests and temple attendants? Considering Jacob's view following the incident, I wonder how you think of the prominence of Levi. And let me add to that the critique is not only there, of course, but in the end of Sefer Bereshit, the end of the book of Genesis, we have in the 49th chapter, as Yaakov is on his deathbed, he says, Shimon and Levi are comrades. Their weaponry is a stolen craft. Into their conspiracy may my soul not enter. With their congregation do not join. Oh, my honor. For in their rage they murdered people, and at their whim they hamstrung an ox. Cursed is their rage, for it is intense, and their wrath, for it is harsh. I will separate them within Jacob, and I will disperse them in Israel. So that's a really harsh critique of Yaakov issues. He hasn't kind of cooled down from it. So I wonder, how do you think of the prominence of Levi given that reaction?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, because one of the things that we see later on, which is kind of the centerpiece of my book here, with the what I'm arguing based on, the classical commentators, an outbreak of mass sexual violence at the Golden Calf episode. We know that, not only were the women and children forced in that regard, but the tribe of Levi did not participate in the making of the Golden Calf or in the sexual violence that ensued around the calf. And the problem is that, of course, the tribe of Levi, their response there too is they massacre a whole bunch of people again. But later on, we're told that that's why they ended up being one of the reasons why they become the temple priests, right? So that's a complicated business as well. I mean,
Shmuel, could I just?
Yes, please.
Can I make a comment? I wanted to relate to what Judy asked. When the Rambam in his Code of Jewish Law, the Mishnah Torah, says something, it's almost never him saying something. He's simply summarizing earlier rabbinic sources. And the laws of the seven commandments of the sons of Noah are found in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, folio 57. So I just opened up the Rambam La'am, which is a very good commentary on the Mishnah Torah. And for each phrase or each sentence here, there's a source in the Talmud. So, for example, why does he say that a woman cannot be a witness? Because that's the way the rabbis in the Tractate of Sanhedrin explicated the verse. It says there, miyad ish velo miyad isha, that the verse says from the hand of a man, and they say, and not from the hand of a woman. They simply took the verses about the 7 laws of Noah in Genesis chapter 9, and they explicated those verses. Of course, we can disagree with their explication, but my point was simply that the Rambam very rarely adds new material. He usually is simply summarizing Talmudic passages, which he does here as well.
And do you view that as a defense of the Rambam or an accusation of the Rambam?
Neither. I just want people to understand what the Mishnah Torah is. It's called Mishnah Torah means the second Torah. He was trying to summarize all of rabbinic law in his 14 books. And sometimes he does express an opinion. So, for example, there's a famous passage in the Rambam where he says that a woman should not go outside of her house more than once or twice a month. And that appears nowhere in rabbinic literature. So Professor Mordechai Akiva Friedman, who's the winner of the Israel Prize for Jewish History, he proved in an article 50 years ago that there the Rambam was influenced by Muslim culture. Because in Islam, women are not supposed to go outside more than once or twice a month. And that particular sentence in the Rambam has no rabbinic source. So here and there you can find a sentence in the Rambam which has no rabbinic source, but 99% of what he says is simply summarizing what the rabbis of the Talmud had to say on a specific topic.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Okay, Ethan, let's go to the Maharal.
Yeah. So the Maharal kind of starts off seeming to take a bit of a different well, we'll let somebody read it and we'll see where it goes. All right.
This is difficult. If only Shechem sinned, what was the sin of the rest of the city for which they deserve to die? Rambam answered that Noachides are commanded to set up courts, and for any sin which they violate, they are killed. Here they witnessed the evil act of Shechem kidnapping Dinah and did not judge him. For this they deserve to die, for they failed to judge him. But truthfully, these words are surprising, for how could they have judged the son of their prince, since they feared him? Even though they are commanded to judge, that is when they can judge, but God exempts one who is under duress. And how could they have judged him? It appears that there is no difficulty explaining why all the males in Shechem deserve to die, because a war between two nations is different. The Jewish people and the Canaanites are considered two nations, as was written, and we will be one nation, implying that initially they were not considered one nation. Therefore, they were permitted to fight, like any nation who fights another nation, which the Torah permits. Even though the Torah says, when you draw near to a city to fight it, you shall offer peace. That applies when they have done nothing to Israel. When they have acted against Israel, as they did here when they breached them to commit an evil act, then even though only one of them sinned, since he is part of the nation and since they instigated, it is permitted to avenge this from all of them. This is so with all wars which they encountered, like attack the Midianites. Even though there were many who had done nothing, this is not a valid distinction. Since they were members of the nation who acted wickedly against the Jewish people, it was permitted to engage all the Midianites in war, and such is the case with all wars. So, just a quick question before we move on. The Jewish war ethic, not forget Jewish, the commonly held war ethic of modernity, that we are to distinguish between civilians and combatants.
Right.
Is this a post-World War II phenomenon, or do we have such an assumption of an ethic like that prior to World War II?
Hmm. I don't know if I can say when that distinction developed. I guess I'm I'm ashamed to say I did as an undergraduate in philosophy decades ago, I did study just and unjust wars, and I remember studying Michael Walzer and others in that regard. But I can't. But you'll have to forgive me. It was decades ago, and I can't remember when that ethic first developed. And I don't know, is there such a distinction in I mean, it's an interesting question as a side here. Is there such a distinction in Jewish law? I guess I'm not aware of that off the top of my head. But it seems here that the Maharal of Prague wants to say, two things. That first of all, he's taking issue with the Rambam, right? That how could they have been expected to bring the prince to justice? He's the prince. They would have been, what was their ability to do that? First of all, or they would have been terrified to do that. So how can we say that they deserve to die? On the other hand, he's saying, right, that this is a nation that has attacked Israel. Even though it was really the prince that attacked Israel. But so maybe he is not distinguishing between, the prince and, let's say, civilians, non-combatants. Because at the end, he's also, to me, he seems to be saying, here we're fighting a nation. So he wants to get them off the hook, but he immediately puts them right back on the hook, it seems to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, Oh, I see a question here in the chat. In the chat.
Wasn't attack the Midianites a directive from God, whereas here Shimon and Levi did this completely of their own accord?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things about this episode with Dinah, which unfortunately we see a number of times in the Torah, is that God is not a character here, right?
One of the difficult things to decipher is it's true today in this war, and it's true here as well. Like, when is something deemed self-defense and when is something deemed revenge?
Right.
And you can interpret one charitably or uncharitably. Mm-hmm. That if you assume the whole community basically shares an ideology and has a tribalistic instinct to protect their own, then they are a collective. There is a kind of a collective guilt as it relates to self-defense.
Right. Exactly.
So it's not hard to imagine a case where Shimon and Levi are acting in a sense in a case of self-defense.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, that may be true. On the other hand, we know that they're outraged on some level because their sister was kidnapped. But what do they do at the end of this? After they've massacred all the men, they run off with the women and children of Shechem, right? So how does that make it, how does that make it better, right?
So, so let me pause if you want to take other questions on this or
Yeah.
comments.
Anybody else have any feelings about this? Any reaction?
I'm bothered by the fact that, in a way, Shechem was trying to engage in teshuvah,
Yeah.
and even if it was a clumsy attempt at teshuvah, even if it's something that teshuvah that the brothers didn't want, never mind that Dinah has no voice at all.
Right.
I'm bothered that someone should be killed when they're trying to do right.
Yeah. Judy, I think it's amazing, and I see that you've read ahead. You've read it. You'll see the next. No. You're good. You're great. You set it up great. I really appreciate that, because you'll see the next couple of pieces that I bring in. One is which, how do we know, where Shechem was going to actually end up in this, and then later, I want to come to a new source that was only brought to my attention after I wrote the book about. It's a contemporary writer who writes in the voice of Dinah, because of course we know that Dinah's voice is nowhere to be found in the text, right? We never hear from her. We hear from all these men. So I appreciate you setting that up. I appreciate you setting that up, Judy. So let's go down to Ramban. This is a long. I'm not going to ask anybody to read this whole thing. But I did want to copy the whole thing just for your consideration, later on. Ramban, a lot of times he'll go through and lay out other commentators' viewpoints, and then before coming to his own. So if you go down scroll down a little further, you'll see a bolded part. So you'll just see the first bolded part. Ramban thus disagrees with Rambam, who writes that the people of Shechem incurred the death penalty by not having brought Shechem to justice. So I wanted to highlight that just so we know where Ramban was going to go. He's not going to hold the population of Shechem culpable for this crime. And then you'll see the next highlighted part. However, it was not the responsibility of Jacob and his sons to bring them to justice. So, Ramban is saying, what gives Shimon and Levi the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner in this regard? That wasn't their responsibility. And then the last bolded chunk here, if you don't mind, Judy, I'm going to ask you to read that, the covenant represented by the circumcision, because I think this is exactly what you were just alluding to.
Covenant represented by the circumcision of the inhabitants of Shechem had no validity in the eyes of Jacob's sons, for it was done to curry favor with their master and did not represent a genuine conversion. But Jacob told them here that they had placed him in danger, as it is said, "You have troubled me to make me odious." And there, that is the time he blessed the other children, he cursed the wrath of Simeon and Levi, for they had done violence to the men of the city, whom they had told in his presence, "And we will dwell with you, and we will become one people." They would have chosen to believe in God and trust their word, and perhaps they might have indeed returned to God, and thus Shimon and Levi killed them without cause, for the people had done them no evil at all. It is this which Jacob said, "Weapons of violence are their kinship."
So, I think that's kind of one of the things that Ramban is saying here, right? Is that, the people didn't do any wrong themselves. They went through this, circumcision, which, may or may not have been a genuine conversion. That's an open question. But there was a possibility, as Judy was saying earlier, that, these people were sincere, maybe even if not Shechem, okay, fine, not Shechem, the person, right? But the population may have actually been willing to, to join as one people, and this may have been a sincere conversion. Why should we, put aside?
Is there an alternative read on why they would have been circumcised?
Oh, yeah.
Other than being sincere?
Well, there's, it's, I think, and I write about it in the book, that it's Nechama Leibovitz who she points out that when you see the language of the negotiation that Shechem had with Jacob and Shimon and Levi, and then the way that that was socialized to the Shechemites, the language is different there, and the focus when Shechem was socializing that information with the Shechemites, it was all about, we're going to acquire their property and this is going to be great. All we have to do is have this. So she reads it, and I bring her as another voice, in the book, in this episode, is that in her viewpoint and in others, this was really about gaining Jacob's property, and so they were willing to do this circumcision just for that. So she suspects whether this was genuine or not. But I mean, look, it's an open question, right? We don't know.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the thing that's about Torah, and why, I kind of use it as a tool to begin to unpack how I see these things, right? I mean, I love Nechama Leibovitz, and she may well be correct, but she may not be correct too. I mean, and the Ramban and Rambam as well, right? I mean, how do I ultimately feel about these things? Am I going to
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. Go ahead, Judy.
Weren't the Shechem people taking their lives into their hands? But I mean, circumcision is a huge commitment.
Yeah.
I don't know personally, but it seems to me that at the time there was no anesthesia and there were no antibiotics. They could have died.
Sure.
Or they could have lost their organs.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it seems, look, I guess, had I not had a bris, and somebody came to me at 55 years old and said, will you do this so that you can have some livestock? I might say, yeah, look, forget the livestock. I'm not that interested. Thank you very much. Right.
Yeah.
Especially somebody with livestock.
So, okay. So Ethan, it's not so hard right now to think about Gaza.
Right.
Here we have some of the most atrocious criminals, the leaders of Hamas, who do just barbaric things did to Israelis and do to their own communities. But there's also innocent civilians there.
For sure.
Most of us would argue, I certainly would.
For sure.
And does this story we're exploring here have any insights on how we might relate to that moment? I mean, one of the complexities here is that the only way to win, if your goal is to defeat Hamas, is to inevitably kill civilians, as opposed to potentially, given how Hamas structures themselves. And so it's obviously a very different story, but I wonder how you relate to this moment, given, such a framework.
Well, I mean, look, there's undoubtedly, people that, look, at the very least, there's newborn, babies there. They certainly can't be said to have any interest, in being part of a war, right? So there's undoubtedly innocent people that are killed there, and I'll say this as well. In the work that I do with the foundation, we do various sorts of things in Israel and work with a lot of different communities. I think all of the different communities in that part of the world in one way or another, and hopefully for the good. But one of the groups we have contact with are people in the military and the government, and we'll hear things like, which I'm sure we've all heard, like, in a normal war, the combatant to casualty ratio is X, right? In this war, we're careful that the combatant to casualty ratio is X minus, so it's better. And the thing is, I'm not on the ground over there, so I can hear that, and I want to believe that, but I have no way to confirm that that's necessarily true, right? What I think I am much more secure in assuming is that there are innocent casualties. I mean, by everybody's admission, there are. I don't know that the war is being, prosecuted in a more or less humane way. Let's see if we can speak about war in that way at all. And when you look at other conflicts, calculations are made to purposefully target civilian centers in order to bring about a speedier conclusion to the war. One thinks of the mass bombing of Dresden towards the end of World War II, or Hiroshima. Exactly. And there's some kind of utilitarian calculation made in those cases, whether that's the right way to think about human life and the prosecution of war or not. Again, I'm not smart enough to say. What I can say is that, I'm deeply uncomfortable with all of it, of course. I mean, and yet I think when I think about another episode that I write in the book, and when one thinks about self-defense and potentially taking another life, when I think about the encounter of Jacob and Esau later in their lives, and Esau may well be coming to kill Jacob. Jacob is seen in that episode to take certain defensive, preemptive action to sort of defend his family. He's anticipating that he'll be attacked by his brother Esau. And yet Jacob, when he sees Esau, says, to see your face is to see Pnei Elohim, to see your face, to see the face of God, which is to say, in my reading of it, you, Esau, are created in the image of God just as much as I am created in the image of God, right? Now, I may have to take defensive action against you and kill you, God forbid, but that doesn't give me the right to dehumanize you or to deny your basic humanness, right? I do have the right and obligation to defend myself and my family, right? But I can't dehumanize you, because to see your face is to see the face of God. Now, where that line lies in the prosecution of a war such as we see in Gaza is, I think, still a question that I wrestle with, I did want to bring really quickly one last source, which was the new one to me. I'll do it very quickly, but this is Atalia Brenner. I don't know if people are familiar with her, but it's so recent to me that I wasn't able to put it in a source sheet. I guess I probably could have this morning, but I'm not that technologically sophisticated, which is why I'm relying on Alex to drive the ship here. But thank you, Alex, for doing that today. So a friend at the Davidson Foundation introduced me to this work, and so Atalia Brenner is writing this book. Sort of, let's say she's writing contemporary midrash, maybe in a way, but bringing women's voices from the Torah, voices that are absent in the Torah. And she writes about this case in Dinah, and I was sort of shocked. I'll read you what she says here. She first quotes Jacob's curse at the end of his life. Shimon and Levi are brothers. Their instruments are Kli Hamas. We dealt with that. Then she says, in writing in Dinah's voice, she says, clearly my father Jacob is displeased with his sons, my brothers, with my brother's action on my behalf. As you may remember, in Genesis 34, he is worried about the political and military ramifications of his son's ostensible reprisal, fearing that the security of his outsider group is compromised. He doesn't behave as a caring father for his raped daughter, me. Rather, like King David, when Tamar is raped by Amnon in 2 Samuel, and Tamar will undoubtedly tell us about, he's more concerned with pragmatic considerations of group survival. And then she brings in a piece by the poet Chernikovsky, who reinterprets in Dinah's voice Jacob's curse. Shimon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of nobility are their weapons. Blessed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it was hard. Let there be many like them in Jacob. And then again, Brenner in Dinah's voice says, do you see how the poet turned everything around? He endowed me with rightful and righteous anger. He allowed me to speak my mind as he sympathetically reflected it in accordance with the imagined situation of rape or date rape. And I thought it was interesting because Brenner, to me, writing in Dinah's voice again, she's saying, obviously she's outraged by, not only being a victim of this violence, but she takes issue with her father Jacob for not massacring the entire population of Shechem. She says what Shimon and Levi did was absolutely what I wanted them to do. My father was sort of had these other concerns over here, and so I thought that's a powerful, I don't know that that's where I am, but I think that's a completely, if I put myself in Dinah's shoes, I can understand that. I can understand that point of view, and I can't take issue with Brenner speaking for Dinah in that way, and I think that's an interesting piece to consider.
Thank you so much. So, friends, we only have about 6 minutes left. So, although I have many other questions, let's open up to anyone here if they have any questions to ask.
We left them speechless.
I'll give them a moment. If they don't have, then I'll jump into mine. But
Sure.
So, Professor Steven Pinker, Harvard psychologist, has famously and controversially argued that the world, by empirical measures, is getting less violent over time. And I wonder if you've thought about violence and sexual violence in particular from a historical lens.
I don't know that that's an accurate assessment. I can't say, I mean, I grew up in Detroit. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, but I also, was in the city in the 1980s. And, unfortunately, this was a city beset by violence. That may be much less so today. And so locally, I guess I can say that. The world, I don't know, and I don't know the empirical evidence that Pinkerton is bringing. But when you see what's happening in Sudan, when you see what's happening in Israel and Gaza and the neighboring countries, when you see what's happening in any number of places around the world, I'm not so sure that I can believe that. Again, I mean, somebody can say that, but how can I possibly confirm that? I don't know.
So one last question for you. Can you share a bit with us about the style in which you wrote the book? Because it's not a conventional writing style for this type of work, and we'd love to hear how you decided to approach this stylistically.
Well, in a nutshell, and again, David knows this, and Shmuley at this point, this. I spent years on the road, hitchhiking and train hopping, and I was influenced in that lifestyle by the beat poets, and in particular, for this style, I guess in particular, William Burroughs, who used to cut up his writing into pieces, throw them up in the air, and sort of rearrange them randomly, and that's how he came up with the way that Naked Lunch and books like that are formatted. And then I was interested also in the School of Poetry at a college in North Carolina. It's no longer around, called Black Mountain College. And there was a poet there, Edward Dorn, who in particular, who each line was a breath, had to be a breath. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to approach Torah like Burroughs, cutting it up into small pieces, and like Dorn, those pieces should all be a breath, and then kind of throw it up in the air, so to speak, and rearrange it into sort of postmodern poetry of Torah. And so that's how I ended up, writing these two books in that style. I didn't want to write them in any kind of academic way. I wanted to write them in the length of a breath. I wanted to write them kind of a conversation with you, the reader, to be in relationship with you. And and frankly, I wanted to cut up the text into little bits.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been fascinating. And I want to encourage everyone to pick up the book. Again, if you're local, we'll give you a free copy next time you're at the VBM office. Otherwise, you can find it online. Although, was it intentional that it's not on Amazon?
Yeah, I mean, I used to travel around and give away my music for free because it was really what I'm interested in is meeting people and forming relationships with them. I mean, that's really what the whole thing is. I'm waving a flag here and trying to find other people that recognize that flag.
Okay, very nice. Thank you so much. So
make a donation to Valley Beit Midrash if you haven't already.
Thank you. So, friends, with Dr. Devorah Steinmetz next week, From History to Story, the Haggadah's Invitation to Imagination, session with Dr. Jeffrey Clausen on his new book, Jewish Ethics, and also Zachary Truboff, The Jews Are a Nation, Unlike All Others, Franz Rosenzweig, and Jewish Uniqueness. Yossi Klein Alevi in town next month if you're and virtual. Thank you all for joining us. And
thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Ethan.
Thank you, David. Good to see you.
Have a great night.